Welcome to the Lubber's Hole, where we're rereading the Patrick O'Brian Aubrey Maturin series. You're with Mike.
And you're with Ian.
And we're right at the beginning of Master and Commander. Ian, can you catch us up with where we stopped last time and what we might be looking forward to today?
It'll be my pleasure, Mike. Last time, we spoke with our friend and natural philosopher James Albright, and we completed the second half of Chapter 2 of Master and Commander. So we're still, like you say, early in the novel here. Jack Aubrey had been disappointed by his trial of 2 long 12-pounder cannons, but he traded them in for a new main yard after an exhilarating day's trial run out and back in the Sophie. As that was going on, Stephen had had the disappointment of seeing the Sophie sailing away, but the relief of seeing her come back, and he got the chance to join the crew later that same day. We ended the chapter with Jack and Stephen and Lieutenant James Dillon setting sail to escort a group of merchant ships. This time, we get the beginning of Jack's first actual mission afloat as commander. It gives us nautical terms. We get beloved characters. We get favorite phrases, at least favorite for you and me, Mike. Yes. We get tales of past actions, references, of course, to the name of the podcast. We get cataleptic terror. You can guess who's going to suffer that. We get original verse. We get a new watch and quarter bill. We get tea without goat's milk, and potential tension between Jack and Dillon and Jack and the crew.
Oh, thanks, Ian. Boy, there's a lot to look forward to in this chapter, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've got this kind of very typical O'Brian opening, which is just full of so many of the things we love about these books. O'Brian starts, 2 bells in the morning watch found the Sophie sailing steadily eastward along the 39th parallel, with the wind just abaft her beam. She was heeling no more than 2 strakes under her topgallant sails, and she could have set her royals if the amorphous heap of merchantmen under her lee had not determined to travel very slowly until full daylight, no doubt for fear of tripping over the lines of longitude. We can't unpack every O'Brian reference all the time, but just for fun, Ian, I think there's a couple we could dig into here.
Definitely. Like you say, he's packing so much into just one paragraph. We have 2 bells in the morning watch. That means 1 hour into the morning watch here. Sailing eastward along the 39th parallel, which means we're sailing along the line of a latitude that is 39 degrees north of the equator, which thankfully is in the Mediterranean. By the way, you can check that out as well on cannonade.net. This is the moment where I think we really get to start to benefit from enjoying following along on Tom Horn's fabulous cannonade.net website there. The wind just abaft her beam, meaning that the wind is coming from just behind square, if you like, just behind the square on. Heeling no more than 2 strakes means that as she heels over, 2 planks width of her wooden timbers are visible. She's under topgallant sails. Topgallant sails are the small sails that go above the topsails, but not as small and specialist and skimpy as the royals. The topgallant sails normally worn when the weather is good and the wind is fair to moderate. Those royals that she could have set, well, she would have only set them if it wasn't for being slowed down by the convoy. So we get a little bit of characterization of the convoy here. An amorphous heap. Well, that's a heap that's kind of disorganized and kind of unstructured, slowing down the Sophie because of their rather sluggish, rather conservative captains. And an actual joke, an actual honest-to-goodness O'Brian joke, traveling very slowly for fear of tripping over the lines of longitude. Of course, as any schoolboy knows, the lines of longitude are entirely theoretical, but we have this really charming idea that the lines of longitude are real and hard and you could actually trip over them.
Yeah, it's just fabulous, and how many authors can kind of put this all in at a 5 a.m. scene in the book, right? This is great. Well, and he continues, and you've talked so often about how, O'Brien paints us a picture sometimes, and he does that just now.
Yeah, he says, the sky was still grey, and it was impossible to say whether it was clear or covered with very high cloud. But the sea itself already had a nacreous light that belonged more to the day than to the darkness, and this light was reflected in the great convexities of the topsails, giving them the lustre of grey pearls.
Wow.
I'm like, how many writers start with beautiful writing like that, and with that kind of style as well?
Right. So we've got O'Brien's jokes, we've got these nautical terms, we've got this gorgeous cinematic reference, and and then we zoom right in at 5 a.m. to our love Jack Aubrey here, and he clearly is delighted to be on his first ship as commander, his first mission. He greets the Marine sentry by his door. He goes up on deck, looks over the rail at the convoy and the sea, looks across, kind of up and down the ship. And O'Brien writes that sent such a jet of happiness through his heart that he almost skipped where he stood. So he's kind of like a little kid at Christmas here.
Yeah.
He walks over to greet Dillon on deck, and O'Brien says, overcoming a desire to shake his hand. So we've talked, with our guests in the past about how, you don't do a lot of handshaking back here quite like this, and certainly not between officers like this. Oh, I'm so happy, shake your hand, right? But it's, here we are with Jack so ebullient, so happy. And he's telling Dillon that, they've really got a lot to do today. They've got to muster the ship's company and decide how to watch and quarter them. So, watch and quarter. I think about drawing quartering, and this is clearly not that.
I'm pretty sure that's pretty far from Jack's mind right now.
Right.
So watching and quartering, they're going to think about how they're going to organize the ship. They've got a hierarchy of like ranks, but they haven't really got an organization of who's going to do what. So watching and quartering means figuring out who's going to stand a watch. Remember, they're going to go to 2 watches instead of 3, so there'll be a port watch and a starboard watch. Who will stand no watch? These are the people who are given the name of idlers, the people who don't have a sailing job to do through the night, so they get to spend the night in their hammocks, at least until the morning, as we're about to discover. So who will be on which watch? And then quartering, what jobs are everybody going to do? Who's going to be rated at what level? Who's going to have what job in which gun crew? Who is going to have a sailing job? Who's going to have a fighting job? What are going to be their action stations? And we also get this idea of people having the job of that is described as being a waster with an I. It comes from the fact that only the best hands got to have professional sailing jobs, being employed aloft or in the actual sailing, and the others are employed in the part of the ship that we call the waist. And very often in the what are called the quarter bills of Her Majesty's ships, you'd see people like stewards, bandsmen, tradesmen, artificers, whose action stations would be in the waist of the ship, that is to say, kind of huddled in the middle of the ship, rather than being either aloft or at a gun's crew. So they're going to have to figure all that out. Like I say, but they've got a bit of a hierarchy, but they don't have a structure yet, and that's a good thing for a captain and a first lieutenant to be talking about. And more importantly, Jack would love to have a happy, optimistic, upbeat conversation with his first lieutenant. In fact, on a day like this, as we're going to see, Jack wants to be friends with everyone, at least pretty much everybody who's aboard his ship. And this is not the first time in this book, nor even in this chapter, that Jack Aubrey is going to really misjudge what Lieutenant Dillon thinks, and particularly what Lieutenant Dillon thinks of him.
Too true. All right, good. So Dillon kind of takes Jack's comment about this watch and quartering and says, yeah, absolutely, things are really confused and disorganized at the moment. He calls it at 6s and 7s, right? With all these extra men they've taken on board and haven't assigned yet here. And Jack says, while Dillon sees this as confusion and disorganization, Jack sees it as, hey, we got enough men to fight both sides of the ship simultaneously, which no man of war could do. Then Jack asks if there are any old Charlottes amongst the new men. And Dillon says that there's only one. And he and Jack start talking about this HMS Charlotte going up in flames when Dillon was in charge, temporarily in command of this hired cutter, the Dart. He had tried to get his people to go to the Charlotte's aid while it was burning. And they really were reluctant. They were, people who were never shy in a fight, never shy of boarding the enemy, could certainly work hard against going into a lee shore, but they were not going to sail into this burning ship whose guns were kind of going off randomly, whose magazine could blow up. And Dillon concludes by saying, there's little to be done with a thoroughly unwilling crew. And Jack thinks to himself, he's thinking about his own crew on this first command, saying, they're now with this new watch, they're going to be deprived of sleep. They've got all these extra men, with this new watch system, as you've described before, Ian, they're not going to be getting their 8 hours now. They're going to be sort of 4 on and 4 off. And all their women have been sent ashore, and that they may be a bit of an unwilling crew themselves.
And it's funny and ultimately tragic when you think just how similar James Dillon and Jack Aubrey are. They're both very empathetic leaders. They both know the value of people feeling motivated. Neither of them are kind of tyrants or floggers. They're so closely aligned in how they want to be leaders, in how they want to conduct themselves. Aye.
Yeah, it is. And we'll hear, as you say, even more about how similar in a lot of ways Dillon and Jack are here. Now, Ian, we got this reference to the old Charlottes.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of our listeners sometimes will say, which of these things are real ships and which of these things are real historical events? How about this one?
Well, the HMS Charlotte was a real ship. She was a ship of the line, a first rate, 100 guns, launched in 1790, so would have been a fairly new, fairly modern ship at the time of these novels and of this action in which she was lost. She was Lord Howe's flagship at a very famous battle, the glorious 1st of June, kind of spoken about in the whole of the rest of the Navy for several decades to come. In 1800, having accidentally caught on fire, however, she exploded. And she was carrying the flag of Lord Keith, husband later on of our friend Queenie, who we heard about, and also going to be a secondary character in our story with Jack later on as well. Horrible story. 673 out of 859 men were lost in this fire. And she's called the Old Charlotte because HMS Queen Charlotte, a newer ship, but with the name of the same queen, was launched in 1810. So we get all of this from our noble source, the Patrick O'Brian Muster Book by Anthony Gary Brown. Get it wherever you get your local books from.
Exactly. We're going to try, especially as we go back through Master and Commander at a slower pace, to point out a lot of the references that are available, for folks who want to dig in some more, and certainly to always credit our sources here. So Jack, decides he's going to climb up in the sails, climb up to the tops to consider some of his thoughts about changes to the rigging to make the Sophie sail better. And remembering that he's a captain now, he decides to go through the Lubber's Hole. We've heard his name before, right? And we're delighted to have him join us here. And this and a couple paragraphs from now, are what gave the podcast its name. So I'll let O'Brien describe this. Ian, you want to take us through O'Brien's description of this great scene?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. Thank you. Ever since the invention of those platforms some way up the mast called tops, sailors have made it a point of honor to get into them by an odd, devious route, by clinging to the futtock shrouds, which run from the cat harpings near the top of the mast to the futtock plates at the outer edge of the top. By the way, in parenthesis, this was the part where our friend Jeremy got really, really, really fed up.
Right.
They cling to them, to these futtock shrouds, and creep like flies, hanging backward about 25 degrees from the vertical until they reach the rim of the top and so climb upon it, quite ignoring the convenient square hole next to the mast itself, to which the shrouds lead directly as their natural culmination, a straight, safe path with easy steps from the deck to the top. This hole, this Lubber's Hole, is, as who should say, never used, except by those who have never been to sea, or persons of great dignity. That's you and me, Mike.
Yeah, and our listeners.
And when Jack came up through it, he gave Jan Jakruski, ordinary seaman, so disagreeable a fright that he uttered a thin scream. "I thought you were the house demon," he said in Polish. And Mike, apart from this very nice and delicate introduction to the geography and the schematics of the Lubber's Hole, I love this random non sequitur of a joke about somebody mistaking Jack Aubrey for a Polish house demon. Really funny.
Right? Oh, gosh. Well, Jack is perfectly at home in the rigging, we learn. He's looking out, 10 plus miles over the horizon. He recalls that, he served in much larger ships and much bigger ships. So he's been much, much higher than this. And remembers in his youth falling asleep there, being sent up for punishment sometimes. He remembers losing his dinner as the ship rolled up here. And as he reminisces, the dawn lights him. He's kind of the tallest thing. So the light starts with him, and it moves down the topgallant sail all the way to the deck. And O'Brien writes, tears welled up in his eyes, blurred his vision, overspilt, rolled down his cheeks. They did not use themselves up in lines upon his face, but dropped 2, 4, 6, 8 round drops slanting away through the warm golden air to leeward. He kind of takes one last look at the convoy's assortment of ships, and then O'Brien writes again, he blew his nose, and with his eyes still fixed on the spar-laden cat, he reached out for the weather backstay, his hand curled around it mechanically with as little thought as if it had been the handle of his own front door, and he slid gently down to the deck, thinking, one new landsman to each gun crew might answer very well. So, so many things going on here, Ian,
It's lovely, isn't it? As well as all its great characterization of Jack, there's a bit of characteristic Patrick O'Brien ambiguity as well. He doesn't explain to us the emotion. He doesn't explain to us even exactly where the tears spring from. But we learn that Jack is a man who cries.
Right.
And we don't know. I mean, maybe these are kind of tears from the physical blinking into the sunlight of an early morning. Are they tears of joy at his new situation? He's taking in all of his command here. Are they tears of nostalgia as he thinks about where he's come from and being the boy climbing the mast? And we're free to put that pattern together. And O'Brien's just showing us this little moment really up close and personal with Jack. I've talked a couple of times now about how this book in these first few chapters seems to me to be wavering a little bit as to who's the hero. But right now in this chapter, we're with Jack, and he's the person that we're empathizing with. And he's very easy to empathize with, right? He's very easy to like.
Yes. And I love, for me, especially being a man who cries easily from joy, as well as from sadness, as well as from, so many things. I empathize so much with him here. And I love the way, he's up here, he's taking all this in, and in the back of his mind, he's going back, over, okay, how are we going to arrange this crew? Let's see. What do I do with my new landsmen? Putting them in, and it's always working on how to make this ship better, how to do things better.
Yeah.
So it's nice. Now, we've got, for Jack, a wonderful day, starting beautifully. For Stephen, it's a very different situation.
Poor Stephen. It's 6 a.m. I'm going to hazard a guess that even for a naturalist and a philosopher, somebody who is more musical and more cerebrally inclined probably stays up late. I'm guessing 6 a.m. is an hour that Stephen hasn't often seen before. The text says, pandemonium broke loose. Pandemonium, that is, to the waking Stephen Maturin. And we go on and hear that he's never heard the unnatural wailing, the strange, arbitrary intervals of the boatswain and his mates piping, up all hammocks. There's a mad rushing of feet, a great, terrible voice calling, all hands ahoy, out or down, rouse and bit, rise and shine, show a leg there, out or down, here I come, with a sharp knife and a clear conscience. And this also reminds me of the boatswain. I can't remember the name of the guy who played the boatswain, but his yelling and cussing is in the background of almost every scene aboard HMS Surprise in the Peter Weir movie. And they've really got to a T this idea of the kind of cussed voice of the boatswain being the context for all of the sounds of the ship. But again, we're getting this laced with some nice Patrick O'Brien nautical stuff that we're just meant to take as it comes. Rouse and bit is referring to the way you rouse out a coil and then fasten it to the bits. He's really threatening that he's going to cut down people's hammocks that they're still asleep in. Showing a leg means putting your leg. We think it means your own leg, but it could also mean the leg of your lady friend. Putting your own leg over the side of the hammock to show that you're awake and that you're worth not cutting down. So there's this whole little extra bit of Royal Navy ritual here, and Stephen is very orally acute, I think you can say. is very easily disturbed and notices things in the oral environment. He hears the sound of 50 to 60 men rushing up the hatchways. He hears the elm tree pump running, the grind of holy stones on the deck, the chain pumps expelling the night's water from the bilge. He wonders if it's an emergency, a battle or a fire or some kind of desperate leak. Perhaps the crew have forgotten him and haven't warned him. So he jumps up. And another little reminder of the fabric of the ship around him. He stands up and rams his head straight away against a beam. And Mike, there's this lovely moment when the steward comes in and takes care of him here.
It's great. The steward comes in, he realizes what's happened, and he's saying to them, "It's these old beams, sir," in the usually distinct didactic voice used at sea for landsmen and on land for half-wits. "You want to take care of them, for they are very, very low." And Stephen just looks at him malevolently, and that look shocks the steward, who starts to ask him, perhaps what he might have for breakfast here. Stephen's having none of this with its splitting head.
Well, there's a relief on the horizon, though, for poor old Stephen and his bad morning mood, because he's about to encounter bacon, right?
Right. Jack makes a Macbeth reference. He says, "I smelt the gunroom's bacon on deck, and I thought it the finest smell I had ever smelled in my life. Araby left at the post." And so we're like, Araby left at the post. Lady Macbeth in the play says, "All the perfumes of Araby will not sweeten this little hand." We'll get this smell off of her. But Jack's saying that the smell of bacon, leaving Araby at the post, as if those perfumes were an Arabian mare left at the starting gate of a race. So Jack with his mixed metaphors, and as you've said before, Jack with his kind of how he maybe remembers Shakespearean plays compared to a general audience.
Oh yeah, this is the schoolboy thing. What's Macbeth include? It includes something about witches, something about all the perfumes of Araby, something about the forest moving, and there's a fight with swords. That's enough.
Right. We'll hear more of these later in the canon, and Jack had his seagoing interaction with Shakespeare, right? Well, and I love this phrase. They're saying that Stephen, who had a great leeway to make up in the matter of victuals, so he hasn't eaten much lately, and there's also this, we know that Stephen's new to the maladies of seamen, but they're talking about breakfast here, and Stephen says, "And conceivably there might be onions as an anti-scorbutic." So here he is, like, we'll have some onions, of course, to prevent scurvy, medically prescribed here. And, as they talk about perhaps what's on their morning menu, we hear one of our favorite lines, "You are my way of thinking entirely." And a few paragraphs later, we hear "with all my heart." So, we're getting a lot of classic O'Brien lines right through here. And we get the introduction. We kind of referred to him a couple times here, but now the introduction with a classic line as, O'Brien says, Jack is saying, "Light along that bacon, Killick, and the coffee. I'm clemmed." So, Stephen tells Jack how well he slept, better than with the tincture of laudanum, an opium product we'll stick a pin into. Yeah. And Stephen apologizes for all this long sleeping and for having just, gotten up. He's now unshaven because and he says, he was kind of worried about shaving there and wonders if sailors cut themselves badly, shaving at sea with the boat tossing around like that. Just says, no, they don't. But they do have a great number of bursten bellies as well as a great deal of pox. So hernias and syphilis, which Stephen can sort of say, yeah, I get that with seamen, given their labors and their fun.
And it says there's more of a job for the surgeon to do than just taking care of the occasional shaving nick as well.
Right.
So, Mike, it's this big day of doing this organizing and figuring out who's here. So we get this really nice set piece event of all hands being called on deck and the reading of the muster book. They're trying to account for all the men who are aboard, make sure that they're here and that their names are kind of correctly entered in the quarter book. There's a lot of diversity among 89 crew members, as we're going to hear. We get the articles of war read aloud, just like a sermon on a Sunday, regarding, as the text says, the governing of His Majesty's Navy, ships of war, and forces by sea. And with all of this really sort of biblical sounding language, we get a list of all the mortal crimes, lack of courage, cowardice, striking of a superior officer, and sodomy, all listed with this idea of a ringing punishment, shall suffer death. And a lot of the social code is described for us here. And by the way, the fact that the seamen are all kind of nodding along and going, yeah, this is familiar. This is what I know. Yeah, now I know I'm back home. It's also not seen as massively oppressive. It's seen as, like, perversely, the common sailors are thinking, yeah, okay, I think I know the rules. And as long as the officers abide by the rules, that's probably going to be okay in my late 18th century view of society and myself. So the power of custom. And this is a very, very familiar thing for Jack and Dillon and for the crew. I don't think it's so familiar for Stephen Maturin, though.
No. I think Stephen's probably wondering a bit, listening to some of these things, and continues to wonder at kind of how people interact with each other on the ship, as we've talked about before. Yeah. And, then Jack introduces Dr. Maturin to the other officers, kind of formally for the first time, for ones that Stephen hasn't met. And even though Stephen suspects what's coming, when he sees Dillon, he is shocked. And O'Brien writes that his face automatically took on a look of veiled aggression and of the coldest reserve. And O'Brien tells us that Dillon's shock is even greater because, unlike Stephen, he really hadn't even heard about this Dr. Maturin. And, it says that Dillon's color changes, but he does not show any emotion. So he's got, not a perfect poker face, but a much better one. And then Jack suggests, with all the work that he and Dillon have to do with this watch and quarter, Jack suggests that Midshipman Mowat shows Stephen the ship while Jack and James work out these watches.
Yeah, and this is another great introduction, not only to an important secondary character, Mowat, and a couple of his proclivities, but this is also going to be the time when Stephen gets to really understand a little bit more about this weird physical environment that he's in. So young Mowat, by the way, I don't think we're told exactly how young Mowat is. He's clearly under 16. He's probably, early high school age, I'm going to guess. And he's got a very, very boyish way about him anyhow. Asks Stephen if he'd like to start in the top first, as Jack had suggested. And Stephen says, you go ahead and I'll imitate your motions. I'll put my hands and feet where you put yours. And as they start to climb, Stephen's not really attending. His mind is drifting off to his thoughts about James Dillon. He remembers being with James Dillon in a group called the United Irishmen, and the text describes that as a society that had at different times in the last 9 years been an open public association calling for the emancipation of Presbyterians, Dissenters, and Catholics, and for a representative government of Ireland, a proscribed secret society, an armed body in open rebellion, and a defeated, hunted remnant. Wow. And we hear a little bit more about how there's been this general pardon, but the lives of important members are still in danger. And association with the United Irishmen is a pretty grave kind of offence against the British state. And none of them now are in regular contact. So people don't know where they stand. And pretty clearly, therefore, Stephen Maturin doesn't know how he stands with James Dillon. And they've been, or at least Stephen has been, quite evasive so far. Stephen Maturin, says the text, was not afraid of any vulgar betrayal, nor was he afraid for his own skin, because he did not value it. But he had so suffered from the incalculable tensions, rancor, and hatreds that arise from the failure of a rebellion, that he could not bear any further disappointment, any further hostile, recriminatory confrontation, any fresh example of a friend grown cold or worse. Wow.
Yeah.
And bless him, Mowat doesn't realize the turmoil that's going on in this person that he's leading up the rigging here. And although Stephen, we learned, not afraid for his skin on an intellectual level, as he climbs, his body is telling him that it's in a state of rapidly increasing terror. 40 foot up on this ladder of moving ropes with the ship continuing to lean over, and he sees only the sea beneath him. And Mike, the text here says, his grip on the ratlines tightened with cataleptic strength, and his upward progress ceased. And I've been there. I'm not a big fan of heights. That, the whole thing just shuts down your legs and your arms, and your whole brain says, no, 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 no. I'm just going to cling on for a while here and hope there's something better happens. He remained there spread-eagled while the varying forces of gravity, centrifugal motion, irrational panic, and reasonable dread acted upon his motionless, tight-cramped person, now pressing him forward so that the checkered pattern of the shrouds and their crossing ratlines were imprinted on his front, and now plucking him backwards so that he bellied out like a shirt hung up to dry. And I'm right there with Stephen. And again, interesting things happening here. I thought we were with Team Jack, but now we've got so up close to Stephen and all of his vulnerabilities that we're with Team Stephen now here as well. And we're getting this really great contrast, Mike, here, I think, between Stephen and Jack, where they want to be and their physical and emotional courage and their relationships. Jack wants to be friends with everyone. He loves climbing the rigging. He loves the ship. Life is good. He's a bit naive and a bit blind, but that's working for him. And Stephen is cautious and careful and really reserved in his relationships and really terrified of the physical environment around him. This gives me a reason to think this friendship isn't going to go all the way in a flash. There are some things that they're going to have to learn about each other for this friendship to really mature here.
Yeah, and they've got, we're starting to see that perhaps they have some real differences, as you just pointed out. And as we know from life, sometimes those differences kind of help us help each other. And sometimes those differences can really drive us apart. So It's going to be fascinating to watch here.
Absolutely.
Speaking about, differences, Mowat and Stephen going up the sides are clearly very different here. So in the ropes here, Mowat slides right down the backstay, kind of appears right next to Stephen and below him and gently takes his ankles and tells him to keep climbing as he places his feet. And O'Brien writes, and after one more hideous swinging backward lunge in which he closed his eyes and stopped breathing, the Lubber's hole received its second visitor of the day. And this is, I think, Ian, this is the moment that cinched it for the two of us, with Stephen and Jack both coming to visit the Lubber's Hole. How could we call the podcast anything else here? So, and I love it how Mowat, guides Stephen right to the Lubber's Hole, and then he climbs around on the futtock shrouds and pulls him through the Lubber's Hole into him here. And then there's this great moment here. And so, Stephen clearly not himself here, if you will. But Mowat goes immediately into, "This is the maintop, sir," said Mowat, affecting not to notice Stephen's haggard look. "The other one over there is the foretop, of course." And Stephen kind of interrupts him. He says, "I'm very sensible of your kindness in helping me up." "Oh, thank you." "Oh, sir," cried Mowat, "I beg. Well, and that's the mainstays. They're just set below us, and that's the forestays. Forward, and you never see one but on a man of war. And so, Stephen here, again, we're talking about differences. I don't think you're going to see many sailors admitting to fear or weakness or any of that. Stephen is like, yeah, man, I just had it. And, I really appreciate you doing this for me. So he's so human. And with all that he's got on his mind with Dillon here, with all this that's brand new to him, I can't help but think a little bit overwhelmed, although Stephen's a pretty capable guy. And I can't help but think that Mowat perhaps is a bit daunted. Here he is with the captain's guest. He certainly doesn't want to lose him overboard here. And this is the great physician that they hope will become the ship's surgeon and who will then be an officer, up above here. So, Mowat can't really acknowledge any weakness in his guest or his superior officer here, but wants to acknowledge Stephen's thanks to him. And I think a minor spoiler alert, these two both turn into great, wonderful, lovable, kind people.
I think that's a spoiler we can cope with.
Yeah.
Well, as Stephen catches his breath and as his pulse subsides, as he's just about made it into the top here, and as Mowat starts to think, well, how am I going to begin to tell this Lubber about this new physical environment that he's in? Perhaps our listeners need a moment to catch their breath. Perhaps our listeners need a moment to take stock of the rigging and go grab yourselves a glass of grog, and we shall be right back. If you're enjoying the podcast, please come and join our supporters on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Lubber's Hole.
Welcome back. I hope everybody's kind of caught their breath from climbing up the rigging there. And Ian, we then jump into many pages of Mowatt's explanation here. How do we want to handle this?
Well, we could pause and explain every word. I think, A, it would take a long time. And B, I'm pretty sure that that's not what O'Brien wants us to do. And you and I have said before that the way all of this nautical jargon works, apart from just being dazzled by the scholarly technical completeness and authenticity of it, it's the scenery. It's the tractor beams and dilithium crystals of this particular kind of a ship. And I just really enjoy, not so much from the pedagogic point of view, but just from the character point of view, how Mowat really thinks deeply about how to get this explained to Stephen the landlubber here. He explains the masts, the sails, the rigging, and all the different parts of the ship. And if you're new to all of this, then maybe this is an opportunity to catch up. Maybe this is an opportunity to take your time through these paragraphs and pick up a source. We really love a book called A Sea of Words. The Gun Room has loads of word lists for definitions. There are online naval slang dictionaries. There are loads of ways of keeping track of all of this. The good news is, if you go looking, you'll find that O'Brien's references all check out here. The bad news is, if you go looking, it'll really, really slow down your progress. So we'll just say that Mowat does this really friendly job. He's got an interesting challenge here, which is his choice of vocabulary. And Stephen at one point says, you could not explain this maze of ropes and wood and canvas without using sea terms, I suppose. No, it would not be possible. And Mowat replies, using no sea terms? I should be puzzled to do that, sir, but I will try if you wish it. No, for it is by those names alone that they are known in nearly every case, I imagine. And maybe you as a reader are just going to enjoy the nautical detail breezing past you. We certainly did, right, Mike? It's fun to relish this and they feel all the words kind of rolling around on your tongue. But I think there's a bit of a writerly game going on here as well. Patrick O'Brien's playing a bit with the idea of highbrow literary criticism, and the idea is that you can't analyze the text except by analyzing the text. If you try to explain language using other language, then eventually you reach a dead end. And you've just got to take the language on the page for what it is. I don't know if he's being postmodern or post-structuralist or metaphysical or anything, or if it's just he's having fun with the language. Only he could tell us.
Well, and to your point, Ian, one of the things that I love is in the midst of all this jargon, O'Brien keeps the story going, keeps building the characters, keeps weaving the plot in. So, I think that's my encouragement to everybody, is to say, don't give up. Don't get confused or distracted. Ian, you mentioned the Gun Room. That's hmssurprise.org. There's all kinds of resources and pointing to all kinds of resources for anything you want to dig in on. And if not, just keep following along with the characters and the stories here. I think that it happens very clearly because as Mowat's going through these descriptions, we find Stephen kind of asking him almost these random questions. And we're told that he's just trying to keep Mowat talking, perhaps to take his mind off the heights, but perhaps, to help take his mind off or to give him some room to process all of this emotional conflict with Dillon. At one point, as he's hearing about the mast, Stephen thinks, and O'Brien writes, Castlereagh hanging at one masthead and Fitzgibbon at the other, thought Stephen, but with only the weariest gleam of spirit. And, it's kind of an odd line here. Here's Stephen, thinking about Dillon, thinking about the United Irishman, thinking about all these masts and everything else. And then he sees these two guys hanging there and has only the weariest gleam of spirit, like he's almost glad of it, perhaps a little bit, but can't quite bring himself here. Ian, what do we know about these guys? Castlereagh and Fitzgibbon?
Yeah, great question. Again, these are real people and a real situation. The United Irishman was a real cause. Robert Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh, was British Chief Secretary for Ireland between 1798 and 1801. He supported a union between Britain and Ireland, and Maturin kind of did not, although, as we'll hear later on, he had quite a nuanced position when you come down to it. Castlereagh resigned when George III rejected the idea of concomitant Catholic emancipation, which Stephen Maturin supports. He supported emancipation for a whole bunch of other religious minorities as well. Let's turn to Fitzgibbon. John, 1st Baron Fitzgibbon, was Lord Chancellor of Ireland from 1789. And good news for Irish people, Britain doesn't have a Lord Chancellor of Ireland anymore. The people of Ireland more or less rule themselves. This guy Fitzgibbon was an opponent of the United Irishmen, although he was, as it happens, from an old Catholic family. He opposed all kinds of religious and political reform in Ireland, and he again supported the union between the British and Irish crowns that was kind of confirmed in 1800 to 1801. So we're picking up on some of the key characters and some of the key memories and associations that are in Stephen's mind as he's distractedly dealing with all of Mowatt's briefing here.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, then, Stephen's pleased that Mowat understands his profession so well. I mean, that's a relief, right? When the dentist is drilling your tooth, you want to know that the dentist has read at least the page on teeth in the textbook. And he's impressed by all of these measurements. And this is clearly one of Mowat's little bits of nerdery. You know, he's taken his tape measure and he's measured everything apart from the new main yard. Mowat explains that he hadn't passed for lieutenant last time because he hadn't been across some of these minor measurements, and he's ready for being tested again. And as he continues to listen, Stephen thinks how absurd it had been to affect not to know James Dillon. A very childish reaction, the most usual and dangerous of them all. And for all Mowat prattling on, Stephen is still pondering on this Irish James Dillon connection here. He and Mowat watch together as the Sophie sets her royals, those highest of the high sails for the getting of the last ounce of boat speed out when it's really, really fair weather. And we remember Mr. Brown's advice back in the dockyard to Jack, your good captain never sets his royals. Nasty, unnecessary flash, gimcrack things. And apparently that's a sign that says Jack Aubrey's going to be a very different captain for the Sophie than the Navy and the former crew of the Sophie have been used to. They watch the bosun who's directing the men to prepare to set the new mainsail, a proper mainsail for their new mainstay, we learn. And Mowat describes the scene in verse, and Stephen is really struck by this. He points out, first of all, in passing, that the bosun is very free with his cane and wonders why the seamen don't turn around and knock him down. And then he says, so you are a poet, sir, beginning to feel that he could cope with the situation. And by the way, this is a little first look at Stephen's views on liberty and oppression and corporal punishment and authority. We also get a first glimpse of Stephen's appreciation of poetry, as well as hearing Mowat's actual poetry chops here. As they start to head down to the deck, Mowat advises that it's a wonderful plan not to look down. And arriving safely on deck, Stephen's surprised that he'd been so timid, and Mowat declaring, there you are, sir, all a tanto, which is a phrase used when a ship, having had some of her masts struck down, has rehoisted them and all the rigging is set to rights. And there is Stephen's back on the deck, and all of his physical rigging appears to be set back to rights here. We've got a great source for you there, Naval History of Great Britain by James Williams, dated 1902, so a very venerable old source.
So as Stephen and Mowat have been up in the rigging, Jack, Dillon, and the clerk, Mr. Richards, are reviewing the draft of new men. Most of them were petty offenders sent by local officials. They, in the text, they call it the beadle, to be pressed into services. And they included foreigners who'd come looking for work. They included out-of-work Englishmen. And there were 3 exceptions, 3 middle-aged seamen, Pram, a former second mate, a Danish gentleman, and 2 Greek sponge fishermen who they believe are called Apollo and Turbid. They don't know why these guys have been pressed. And with a complete count of the men and an assessment of their abilities now in hand, they create these new watches. Who's, as you said, Ian, who's going to be stationed, who's going to be doing what, who's going to be sleeping when, who's going to be where with what jobs here. As Jack and Dillon and Richards are finishing that, Mowat and Stephen continue the ship's tour down below. And now they're into the midshipman's berth, this small little room where the midshipmen live. And Mowat enters, and he's teasing an even younger Babington, another character we'll know and love here. And, Babington and Mowat are kind of going back and forth to each other, as you can imagine, a little bit older and a little bit younger schoolmates would. And Stephen sees that Babington is studying trigonometry when they've interrupted him. And Babington is kind of complaining that he had just about had the answer until this Mowat shows up. And Mowat immediately breaks out and says, kind of like earlier in the math, in canvassed birth, profoundly deep in thought, his busy mind with signs and tangents fraught, amid reclines, in calculation lost, his efforts still by some intruder crossed. So another burst of original verse, by Mowat, our budding poet here. And, they continue to talk about the quarters, about the ship, and the three of them are talking about, Stephen's kind of asked, well, kind of what's a ship and how's that different from other things? So they have all these different definitions of ships and boats, and it becomes very nuanced and confusing and clearly prejudiced towards whatever definition is used. There's the clear superiority of Royal Naval vessels.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a presumption, right? That's a given.
Absolutely.
And I don't think Stephen is yet able to figure out whether this beautiful lilting poetry in iambic pentameter is like, that's how all people talk below decks. He's about to find out. They're moving, he and Mowat, towards another part of the ship. It's very dimly lit. Stephen stumbles over a man on the floor, his feet shackled to a bar. And the man calls out, by the way, not in rhyming iambic pentameter, "Can't you see where you're a-coming to, you grass-combing bugger?" And Mowat, with a certain primness, informs Stephen that the man is in irons for being rude.
Yeah, right.
And we get this really clear picture, which we've already had hinted at, but it's really brought to life for us here, just what a cramped and imposing space this is. Stephen asks if the next space along the deck here is for the inferior officers, and he learns that it's where all 77 hands and Marines are going to sleep. And Stephen says, but it's physically impossible. And he learns about the 14 inches of hammock room per man, which turns into 28 inches when half of the men in the mess are on deck on watch. And Stephen learns to his horror that there are no windows, there's no bathroom. The sick men are going to berth in the same room, perhaps closer to the scuttle. Well, said Stephen Maturin, if ever a man with the jail fever, or the plague, or the cholera morbus sets foot in this apartment, God help you all. Amen, sir, said Mowat, quite aghast at Stephen's immovable, convincing certainty. And apart from this reminder of the environment, we get Stephen and Mowat as characters really nicely put together there in one sentence. And Mowat's not aghast at the idea of disease and death. He's aghast at the idea of somebody from the outside being so sure in their criticism of a naval institution like berthing in hammocks.
Right. Well, Jack and Stephen are now back together. Stephen's finished the tour. Jack's finished his duties. And Jack offers him for the first time a little bit of grog, the drink of the ship here. And Stephen compliments Mowat to Jack, what a fine young man he is. And Jack says there's nothing pleasanter than good shipmates. Then Jack, starts to take Stephen into his confidence a little bit and says he's really worried that he's upset Dillon. He says that as they were reading the list of names on the starboard watch, Jack had heard a number of Irish names. And he says, more of these damned Irish papists. This is what he had said to Dillon. At this rate, half the starboard watch will be made up of them, and we shall not be able to get by for beads. Oh, and Jack explains, that he meant it pleasantly, but he noticed a damned frigid kind of chill. And he said to himself, why, Jack, you damn fool, Dillon is from Ireland, and he takes it as a national reflection, whereas I had not met anything so illiberal as a national reflection. Of course, I hated papists. So I tried to put it right by a few well-turned flings against the Pope, but perhaps they were not as clever as I thought, for they did not seem to answer. Oh, boy.
Oh, Jack. By the way, this is bang up to date. Yeah. When I say I hate X, it doesn't mean I hate Y. It means I just hate, he's completely tone deaf about identity. Irish, that's completely different from Catholic. If I make Irish jokes, they're different jokes from Catholic jokes. No. He's completely failed to see this point about James Dillon's identity. And by the way, by extension, Stephen's identity.
Yes.
And yeah, well done, O'Brien, for writing about stuff that would be current in 2022. And Stephen, and I don't know if this is as an admonishment or a polite sort of roast, but Stephen asks Jack if Jack himself, hates papists. And Jack says, well, yes, I hate papists, the same as I hate paperwork. He explains that one of his childhood friends, and I think, again, this is Queenie, he refers to her as the pretty girl who taught him navigation. Her mother married a papist, and she was so upset that she studied mathematics and Hebrew. And he rattles off these flings about the rebellion, and Stephen explains the more nuanced reality, which is that United Irishmen were primarily Protestants, with Protestant leaders trying to unite Protestant and Catholic and Presbyterian Irishmen, which is a nuanced point that's invaded most people who've tried to govern Ireland, and particularly the north of Ireland, for the last 250 years, but never mind. It's clear that Jack is frustrated by the day's paperwork, and he says, well, I'm ready to hate all of them, Papists, Anabaptists, Methodists, Jews, all of them, just like the Tom Lehrer song. But he's especially vexed, actually, that he's upset Dillon. And I think he's vexed as well that Dillon hasn't quite got in with the naval bantering humour that Jack regards as just part of kind of daily discourse in the mess here. As I was saying, continues Jack, there is nothing pleasanter than good shipmates. He, meaning Dillon, has a sad time of it, doing a first lieutenant's duty and keeping a watch, new ship's company, new captain, and I particularly wished to ease him in. Without there's a good understanding between the officers, a ship cannot be happy, and a happy ship is your only good fighting ship. And Jack goes on and tells Stephen that Nelson believed this, and Jack knows it to be true, and he's about to ask Stephen to help out with the Dillon situation when Dillon himself walks in.
And this is a fabulous scene here that we've got Jack gone sideways with Dillon, not understanding that he would have put himself also sideways with Stephen, where Stephen not a bit more compassionate and willing to be a little bit of a Socratic teacher here with Jack. But then we see slightly more about Stephen. O'Brien writes partly for professional reasons and partly because of an entirely natural absence. Stephen had long ago assumed the privilege of silence at table, and now, from the shelter of this silence, he watched James Dillon with particular attention. So, Jack's about to ask him, hey, can you kind of help me butter up Dillon and, smooth things over? But Stephen's got his own issues that Jack's completely unaware of. And, we've had some of our listeners, this is kind of a mild spoiler alert here. Some of our listeners have asked us about another, if you will, professional interest of Stephen's, which is very clear in future books, and wondered, if that was going on here. So I just kind of like to say maybe this idea where O'Brien writes for professional reasons, Stephen assumes this silence at table, that maybe this is a little allusion to another professional interest of Stephen's, but we'll say no more here. After all, loose lips sink ships.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Stephen thinks that Dillon looks almost exactly the way he used to when he knew him. And he notes that despite being a much smaller physical man than Jack, he seems to take up as much room as the much larger Jack. So back to your point in about how, we keep getting these little hints, how Jack and Dillon are very similar here. Yeah. But he also notes that Dillon's former typical look, that look of being just about to laugh or just about having, kind of worked out some private witticism, has disappeared from his face. Again, that's also something that we'll come to find is very much part of Jack. You almost always see this. But for Dillon now, Stephen notes it's been replaced with what O'Brien calls a grave, humorless Irish countenance. And although he's civil and attentive and not sullen or resentful, he's not given to smile. He's not given to be loose the way he had been in former times here. So at dinner, Stephen is kind of watching Dillon. He's also watching Jack. He's watching the provisions that Jack had bought, kind of at the last minute to bring on board to entertain his guests. This ham and wine that were clearly, as Stephen said, the sort reserved for officers who buy their own provisions. That is, kind of in Stephen's mind, he's saying, he's been sold subpar goods because the proprietor knew that, here's a captain ready to go to sea quickly that doesn't know any better and has some money at the offing. So I'll just give him some of the worst that I've got and send him off.
Yeah. Killick is going to have to step up on this matter in the future, I think. But never mind. For now, it was Jack.
Right. Too true.
And poor old Jack has got the consequences to deal with here. He tries to carve this ham, described in the text as a hog with a long-born crippling disease. And Stephen and Dillon communicate with a bit of subtext. Dillon asks if perhaps they've met before, and Stephen says he's often mistaken for his cousin with the same name, that being a shame because his cousin has the look of an informer, and no one is more despised in their country, Ireland, than informers, even though the country's swarming with them. And this little exchange of kind of nods and winks hits home with Dillon, who says, I am entirely of your way of thinking, and asks to have a glass of wine with Stephen, who says, to use our favourite phrase, with all my heart. And these are great lines from the canon that we're going to hear over and over again, and you're going to hear them at the end of most episodes of The Lubber's Hole too.
Right. A glass of wine with you.
And after dinner, we get the drawing of the cloth. That is to say, they've cleared the table of the main eating and drinking implements, and they're passing the wine around. Jack asks Dillon to tell the story of the action that he had in the Dart. And Dillon tells him about this 8 4-pounder cutter that he was in temporary command of with 13 men and a boy. And he tells a story about conveying a king's messenger, about, by the way, he remembers nicking his chin while shaving, and Stephen says, ha, with great satisfaction, harking back to the conversation earlier on about shaving. And they had this relatively paltry armament. They came across this enemy, and they figured that since they would be able to outsail one of these enemies, they would attack them separately before they could join forces. And we get this conversation about this action with a relatively small crew, with some English passengers aboard as well. They'd exchanged fire. This French ship had their foreyard carried away. The French ship had caught fire. The privateer had struck, and Dillon told the captain that he'd come back and sink her if she tried to get away. And off he went after the second ship, the second privateer. And as they approached, he gave her a broadside, which, due to being smartly aimed and chosen just at the moment when the roll of the two ships was just at the right level, they shot her through the hull below the waterline, and she sank with all her sails set. Mike, it's a very dramatic story. It's told in the usual deadpan naval style by Dillon, but A, Jack Aubrey is eating this up, and B, this, I don't know if it is or not, but this sounds like a really Cochrane-ish action.
Right.
And as I'm listening to this, and of course we're going to hear that Jack is really applauding, once again, Jack and Dillon are so similar in their temperament, in the kind of action that they value, and in the way they conduct themselves, making decisions in the heat of battle. Like, Dillon is a mini Jack with red hair, or perhaps the other way around.
Right. This idea of, going up 3 enemies, going kind of straight at them and, really taking them on rather than saying, how do I get the heck out of here, and doing it against such high odds. I mean, I think Jack is he just loves this. And it kind of, back to remind us that Jack had said earlier to Stephen that perhaps Dillon should have been promoted ahead of Jack because of an action like this. But Jack and Stephen both congratulate Dillon on this noble action, and Jack proposes a toast. Once again, as you say, so tone deaf. Renewed success of Irish arms and confusion to the Pope. And Stephen, instead of, kind of Dillon's earlier reaction to Jack's faux pas, Stephen kind of laughs and says, well, to the first 10 times over, and that even though he's a Voltairean, he won't drink to the second. He's not going to drink to confusion to the Pope. He says the poor gentleman has bony on his hands, and that is confusion enough in all conscience. Besides, he's a very learned Benedictine. So Jack, completely unaware of what he said here, amends his toast to confusion to bony, and they all happily drink to this. Voltairean, it's kind of a fascinating allusion back to this idea of, where we've still got, especially with Stephen, this Enlightenment thinking, this kind of the dominance of reason. But with Voltaire, an interesting combination of Enlightenment, reason, and religion, where, Voltaire, like many of the Enlightenment sort of philosophers and learned gentlemen, was a deist. God started things, but then God kind of left us to ourselves here. But he was somebody who, because... And he believed, Voltaire did, that he was a deist out of reason, not by faith. And therefore, sort of says, yeah, you know what? We should have freedom of religion because nobody knows any better than anybody else. Certainly none of them should be whipping us with, what God wants us to do and have a duty to enforce what they know secretly that God believes. But there's a fascinating article in the Irish Times in March 2nd, 1996, called Champion of the Enlightenment, where you read about O'Brien kind of using a very similar quote. So clearly O'Brien is bringing himself in through the person of Stephen Maturin here.
It's really great, isn't it? These little bits of philosophy that go miles deep. Really early in the story, really important connections to Stephen Maturin. And if you know about Voltaire and you know about philosophy, you can really understand a lot about Stephen's motivation later on. If you don't, you can get by just fine with Stephen's a learned cove who can quote Voltaire at the dinner table.
Right.
And the conversation continues with just Jack and Stephen. Dillon has to leave the table to go and take watch. And Jack is really praising up Dillon's victory. Interestingly here, he's praising it up to Stephen in the absence of Dillon, and that may be a false step for Jack. Let's see. Lord, said Jack, what a pretty action. 146 to 14, or 15 if you count Mrs. Dockeray, the wife of the English guy. It was just the kind of thing Nelson might have done. Prompt, straight at him. And by the way, we now get a little bit of dialogue that was taken up again in the Peter Weir movie, Master and Commander, but spoken by different people than Stephen and Jack here. Stephen says, did you know Lord Nelson? What kind of man was he is? Jack describes him as being small and frail, but like a charged atom. And comes back up with this line about, pass me the salt. And also the famous line, never mind maneuvers, all go straight at him. And he's connecting that kind of conduct to what he admired about what Dillon had done in the story that was told here. And here we get this great moment of a story about Nelson being offered a boat cloak on a cold night. And Nelson says to the person who offered the cloak that his zeal for king and country kept him warm. And was it any other man, you would cry out, oh, what pitiful stuff, and dismiss it as mere enthusiasm. But with him, you'll feel your bosom glow. And that's not Russell Crowe, that's Jack Aubrey.
Right.
And this comes out just before he's interrupted. Once again, a scene of some intensity and some real discovery for us gets undercut by some routine, slightly comic minutiae as Mr. Richards comes in with more paperwork. Anyway, we've established Nelson as a hero of Jack's. We've established this great common attitude to sailoring and warfare between Dillon and Jack, if only they could realize it of each other. And we'll kind of come back to this all later on in the canon, I think.
Yeah. Well, part of this paperwork that Richards has walked in with are a number of letters written by Captain Allen that I guess he dictated and were left to be written out fair, as they say, to kind of do the final draft and send off. And the top one, Jack looks at it and then tells Stephen, this is just so like the service that here we're in the middle of talking about patriotic fervor, and they want me to sign a letter like this. And it's a letter, O'Brien, gives us the text of it, that orders a court-martial for Isaac Wilson, the man that Stephen had tripped over earlier, the one who was, in irons for quote unquote, being rude. And I guess now we know perhaps what Moat was saying. It's for the crime of sodomy on a goat. And, here we have another moment, in the midst of this sea tale where O'Brien is kind of lifting us into this hothouse ship, looking deeper into these characters and about, how they see things perhaps the same or differently from people of their time. So Stephen makes an observation about how the law always seems to harp on the unnaturalness of sodomy. But Stephen says, I know two judges and two barristers who are pederasts. And, Jack's like going on saying, he's not all for this either, that this man is going to be hanged with boats from every ship in the fleet watching. Stephen says, that's, a little extreme. And Jack says, well, it's an infernal bore. He doesn't want to waste all the time of the men testifying. He doesn't want the Sophie to be a laughing stock in front of the entire fleet. Now, he says that he does believe, as kind of custom of the service, that the goat must be slaughtered and then served out to the men who informed on Wilson, and Stephen goes further than that. He says, well, perhaps, Jack, you could just land them both ashore. Let's do none of this. And then Stephen says, and I think it's a little poke at O'Brien humor and perhaps Stephen humor at Jack. Separate shores if you have strong feelings on the moral issue. If you feel that the man and the goat shouldn't be together, but then just sail away. And, Jack says, perhaps there's something in what you're saying. And he's considering it, and then asks Stephen if he'd like milk with his tea. Now, we already know from the dinner at the Crown that Stephen takes milk with his tea. And Stephen asks, well, is it cow's milk or goat's milk? Learning that it's goat's milk, he says that, perhaps he'll have his tea with no milk. So, Stephen, again, here's O'Brien saying, here's Stephen, who's very enlightened. And he's saying, let's not condemn this.
Yeah.
Let's not do this. But although, by the way, I won't have any of the goat's milk in my tea, so that we all have a little bit of all of this in us here.
Yeah, we're all a little bit prejudiced. And it's not a completely liberal, completely enlightened version of the view either. Stephen uses the word pederast to describe barristers and judges. Pederast is somebody who likes boys. And that's a real bad trope that people associate being gay with having a taste for the underage, and that's absolutely not the thing. So yes. We're not getting a correct 21st century version of Enlightenment here. We're getting an imperfect early 19th century version of Enlightenment, but at least we're getting it, and at least we're hearing these two characters debating it, and I'm fine with that.
We talk about evolution in natural philosophy. What we're getting here is a bit of evolution, just a little step forward and a little step sideways, and sometimes a little step backwards.
Yes, especially if you happen to take milk in your tea.
Right.
Anyhow, in the gun room, the place where the officers mess, well, this has caused some confusion for Stephen at various points because he doesn't know why the gunner doesn't live in the gun room. Anyway, set that to one side. In the gun room where the officers are sitting and having their meal, the master, Marshall, and the purser, Mr. Ricketts, are talking about how much room there is on the ship and the impact of all these changes coming from Jack's new organization and new quartering and new tactics and new rigging and new everything else. Ricketts says he doesn't know how these changes are going to work out. And Marshall, there's an important juxtaposition here because Marshall's gay and has a bit of a thing for Jack already, and is very willing to praise Jack and to think positively about him. Ricketts, on the other hand, is a bit conservative and a bit old-fashioned about how he sees Jack. Ricketts says all these capers, he says the main yard, the guns, the drafts that he says Aubrey pretended to know nothing about, new hands with no room for them, 2 watchers. Ricketts says his son Charlie says there's a great deal of murmuring in the crew. And Marshall agrees. He says, yes, there have been changes, and the captain may be a bit flighty, but he'll be fine if they're standing officers. That means you and me, Mr. Ricketts. And Watt and Lamb, the bosun and the carpenter, seem to like him. Dillon's a good lieutenant. The captain's a good seaman, as they've seen sign off already. And Marshall thinks things will get a bit more lively around here, but it'll be okay, he says, if everybody else supports the captain. And Ricketts thinks the master is just a bit soft on Aubrey and believes that if what he calls these capers keep up, and he believes that it's the captain's nature that means that they will keep up, the captain will be put out of the Sophie pretty quickly. So,
Ricketts sort of sums it all up. And Ricketts, we know, is the guy that Jack caught with his purser's tricks and has threatened, his son. So, we got all sorts of people for all their different reasons here. Ricketts says, for a brig is not a frigate, far less a ship of the line. You're right on top of your people, and they can give you hell or cause you to be broke as easy as kiss my hand. So Ricketts, almost like Jack had threatened him, threatening Jack here. And again, this, what we talked about with O'Brien in this hot house, tight, enclosed space, and particularly in the Sophie, which is even much smaller, as Stephen has discovered today here. So he tells Marshall, that a captain needs more than seamanship. And, Ricketts has this really interesting description here. Any damn tarpaulin can manage a ship in a storm, he went on in a slighting voice, and any housewife in breeches can keep the decks clean and the falls just so. But it needs a headpiece, tapping his own, that is, tapping his own head, and true bottom and steadiness, as well as conduct, to be the captain of a man of war. And these are qualities not to be found in every Johnny-come-lately or in every Jack lie by the wall. Neither, he added, more or less to himself, "I don't know, I'm sure." So,
End of chapter 3.
yeah, Ricketts certainly not willing to give his endorsement here.
Yeah, he's setting out the exam question there for Jack. He's saying you've got to show more than you've shown us so far.
And kind of, I think, saying here to Marshall and to himself, and you're not going to do it. I'm sure you're not going to do it, right?
Yeah. Johnny Come Lately, most of us know what Johnny Come Lately is. We had a look for what does Jack lie by the wall mean. And lie by the wall is a bit of an obscure phrase, and it's hard to see how it fits in here, how you parse it. Lie by the wall is taken often to mean someone who's dead but unburied, or in the case of a ship, being laid up in dock and useless. So neither of those is a happy image for a Jack, particularly not for our Jack. And,
right.
And Mike, it looks like there's tension brewing on the Sophie. Jack has offended Dillon. May or may not be able to recover that. He's upset some of the crew with the watch patterns and his new way of sailing and fighting the ship. It's been chaotic with all of them, the mad dashing around so far under his command. The purser is not his friend. The purser's son may not be either. After all, they've both now been threatened by Jack. Marshall and Lamb and Watt seem to be more impressed with Jack than the other officers. We're not completely clear, though, on what Dillon's thinking. And we only have Jack's report and our own sensibilities that tell us that Jack's stepping all over this relationship and is continuing to do so even when he tries to make things better. And hearing Dillon's action story, I think we have to agree with Jack's assessment that perhaps Dillon was more deserving of promotion more quickly than Jack had encountered.
We've been going through this chapter, and it's clear, Stephen and James Dillon seem to have a better understanding of each other, but it sounds as though there's still a good bit of tension between former United Irishmen, including Stephen and James Dillon, and Jack and James Dillon, starting here with this big misunderstanding. I hate to see that, as you had said, but there's still a full convoy behind them, all these ships behind them, a journey ahead. And as Dillon's action demonstrated, there are plenty of opportunities for action, for glory, or perhaps, as Mr. Ricketts suggests, for more capers.
Well, I think that all lies ahead of us, Mike. I don't know. What do you say to just a little bit more Patrick O'Brian?
I would like that of all things. Jack and Stephen, meet up on deck, and they're both discussing, what should we have for bacon? What should we have for breakfast? There you go, Sam. Number 2.